Margaret was 67 years old, a retired schoolteacher from a small town outside Knoxville, Tennessee, who spent her mornings the way she had for decades, waking before sunrise, making a pot of strong coffee, and tending to the raised garden beds she had built herself the summer after her husband passed. Gardening was not a hobby for Margaret. It was her identity, her therapy, and the thing that kept her connected to every season of her life. She told me once that as long as she could dig her hands into the earth, she felt like herself. But for about 2 years before she came to see me, Margaret had been waking up with hands so stiff she could barely grip her coffee mug. By the time she made it to the back door, her knees ached with every step down onto the patio. Her hips felt like they belonged to someone 30 years older. She had seen her regular doctor twice about it. She had been told it was arthritis. She had been told it was her age. She had been handed a pamphlet and a recommendation for over-the-counter anti-inflammatories, and she had been sent home. What nobody told Margaret, and what I want to spend the next several minutes telling you, is that what she was experiencing every single morning was not primarily an arthritis problem. It was not simply a joint problem. It was a gut problem. And the morning she understood that distinction, everything changed for her. I'm Whitney, and I'm a physician who has spent a significant part of my career focused on how the aging body works differently, not worse, but differently, and how the medical system consistently fails to explain those differences to the people who need the information most. This channel exists because appointments are short, waiting rooms are long, and there is a category of knowledge that sits between what your doctor knows and what you've been told. That gap is where I live. That gap is where we work together. What I want to talk to you about today is morning joint stiffness, not the kind that comes from a diagnosed autoimmune condition or structural joint damage that has shown up clearly on imaging. I mean the kind that millions of adults over 60 experience and have been told is simply the price of getting older. The kind where you wake up and your body needs 45 minutes to remember how to move. The kind that has been quietly stealing your mornings and making you wonder how many good years you actually have left. Here is the lens I need you to look through for this entire conversation. Your gut is not just a digestive organ. In the last 15 years, the science on this has shifted in ways that most general practitioners have not fully incorporated into how they counsel older patients. Your gut lining is in constant communication with your immune system. Roughly 70% of your immune tissue lives there. And your immune system, when it is chronically activated, produces compounds called inflammatory cytokines that travel through the bloodstream and settle, with particular enthusiasm, into your joints. What you feel as stiffness, as that deep morning ache, is very often the physical sensation of low-grade systemic inflammation. And that inflammation has a starting point. In the majority of cases I have seen, that starting point is the gut. This is the part most people never find out. Not because the research doesn't exist, it does, but because connecting those dots takes longer than a 12-minute appointment allows. Margaret's story did not end with that pamphlet, and yours does not have to end with a label that explains nothing and changes nothing. Today I'm going to walk you through 5 specific reasons your gut is driving your morning stiffness, and I'm going to give you a simple morning protocol that costs nothing and takes less than 10 minutes. By the time we're done, you will understand your own body better than most people half your age. Before we go further, I want to know where you're watching from today. Drop your city or your state in the comments below. I read every single one, and it helps me understand who I'm talking to. Now let's get into this. The first thing I need you to understand is what is actually happening in your body during those hours between when you fall asleep and when you try to stand up. The first thing I need you to understand is what is actually happening in your body during those hours between when you fall asleep and when you try to stand up in the morning. Because the timing of your stiffness is not random. It is a biological signal, and once you learn to read it, you stop accepting it as normal and start treating it as information. Here is the mechanism. While you sleep, your body shifts into a repair and immune surveillance mode. Cortisol, the hormone that acts as a natural anti-inflammatory, is at its lowest point in the early morning hours, somewhere between 2 and 6 a.m. At the same time, your immune system becomes more active. If your gut lining is compromised, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by that in a moment, your immune system uses that quiet overnight window to respond to bacterial particles and undigested proteins that have crossed where they should not have crossed. By the time your alarm goes off, that immune response has already been running for hours. What you feel when you swing your legs over the side of the bed is the accumulated result of that overnight inflammatory process settling into the synovial tissue surrounding your joints. This is why anti-inflammatories taken at night sometimes help more than the same pill taken in the morning. Not because of the pill, but because of the timing of the process. Your doctor may never have framed it that way for you. But that framing matters because it points directly at the source. The first gut factor I want to talk about is something called intestinal permeability, which you may have heard referred to as leaky gut. I want to use that term carefully because it has been misused in wellness spaces, but the underlying science is real and it is well documented. A 2017 analysis published in the journal Frontiers in Immunology confirmed that increased intestinal permeability is associated with elevated systemic inflammation markers in older adults, and that this association strengthens with age. What happens is this. The cells lining your small intestine are held together by structures called tight junctions. Think of them as the grout between bathroom tiles. When that grout degrades, things get through the wall that were never supposed to. Bacterial fragments called lipopolysaccharides slip through. Your immune system, which is stationed just on the other side of that lining, sees those fragments as invaders. It launches a response. That response is inflammatory, and because it is low-grade and constant rather than acute and obvious, it never rises to the level of an emergency, but it never fully stops either. I had a patient, a retired nurse named Carol from outside Atlanta, who had been living with what she described as a body that felt 20 years older than her mind. She was 64. She exercised. She ate what she considered a clean diet. She had been told her joint panel was unremarkable. What was not unremarkable was her gut history. 2 rounds of broad-spectrum antibiotics in the previous 3 years, a period of high stress following her husband's cardiac surgery, and a diet that was healthy by conventional measures, but low in the specific fibers that feed beneficial gut bacteria. When we addressed those factors, her morning stiffness was reduced by more than half within 8 weeks. She told me she had gotten her mornings back. What to do with this first factor? Start paying attention to your antibiotic history and your fiber variety, not just quantity. A diet high in 1 or 2 fiber sources is not the same as a diet high in diverse fibers. I'll come back to exactly what that looks like in the protocol section. The second gut factor is the composition of your gut microbiome itself, specifically the ratio of inflammatory to anti-inflammatory bacterial strains. Research from the Mayo Clinic and several European longitudinal studies has shown that adults over 60 show a measurable reduction in bacterial diversity compared to younger adults, and that this reduction correlates with higher circulating levels of interleukin-6, one of the primary inflammatory cytokines implicated in joint tissue inflammation. Here is what that means in plain language. Fewer good bacterial strains means less production of short-chain fatty acids, which are the compounds your gut lining uses to repair and maintain itself. Less repair means more permeability. More permeability means more immune activation. More immune activation means more morning stiffness. It is a cycle, and it is a cycle you can interrupt. I want to hear from you right now. If you have been told your joint pain is just arthritis or just aging, type the word morning in the comments, because I want to know how many of you have been handed that answer without any further explanation. Stay with me, because what comes next is where this gets genuinely surprising. The third gut factor is one that I find myself explaining more than almost any other in my practice, and it is the one that tends to produce the most visible shift in a patient's expression, that particular look of quiet recognition mixed with a little frustration. Because this one involves something that most people over 60 have been doing consistently, something they were told was healthy, something they may have been doing for years without ever suspecting it was contributing to the very problem they were trying to manage. Proton pump inhibitors, acid-reducing medications. If you are taking one of these, either by prescription or over the counter, I need you to stay very close with me right now. I am not telling you to stop taking your medication. Please hear that clearly. Any changes to your medication routine need to happen in conversation with your physician. What I am telling you is what the conversation you need to have actually looks like, because most people are never prompted to have it. Here is the mechanism. Your stomach acid is not your enemy. I know it feels that way when you have reflux, but stomach acid serves a critical protective function in your gut ecosystem. It is the first line of defense against pathogenic bacteria. It also plays a direct role in protein digestion, breaking proteins into forms that your immune system can recognize as food rather than threat. When stomach acid is chronically suppressed, two things happen that are directly relevant to your joints. First, bacteria that would normally be destroyed in the stomach survive and migrate into the small intestine, a condition called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which drives intestinal permeability. Second, incompletely digested proteins reach the gut lining in forms that trigger immune reactivity. A 2020 review published in the journal Gut examined long-term proton pump inhibitor use in adults over 60 and found significant associations with altered microbiome composition, reduced bacterial diversity, and elevated systemic inflammatory markers, the same markers we see elevated in people with chronic joint inflammation. I had a patient named Ruth, 71, a former librarian from rural Missouri who had been on a proton pump inhibitor for 11 years. She had never been told there was a long-term reassessment window. She had been given the prescription during a stressful period in her early 60s and simply continued refilling it. When her gastroenterologist finally reviewed her case and worked with her on a supervised taper, combined with dietary adjustments to support stomach acid function naturally, her joint stiffness improved in ways that genuinely surprised her. She called it the unexpected benefit nobody mentioned. What to do here? Ask your doctor specifically and directly whether your acid-reducing medication has been reassessed recently and whether a supervised taper is appropriate for your current situation. That is the conversation. You deserve to have it. The fourth gut factor is chronic low-grade dehydration. And I want to be precise about why this belongs in a gut conversation rather than a general health conversation. The mucosal lining of your gut, the layer of protective mucus that sits between your gut contents and your gut wall, is almost entirely water dependent. In adults over 60, the thirst mechanism becomes measurably less reliable. You can be significantly dehydrated without feeling thirsty. A 2018 study from the European Journal of Nutrition found that older adults who increased their daily water intake by as little as 2 cups showed measurable improvements in gut barrier integrity markers over a 12-week period. Less mucosal degradation means better barrier function. Better barrier function means less inflammatory signaling reaching your joints overnight. The fix here is structural, not motivational. it is not about trying harder to remember to drink water. It is about placing water where your body is before your brain is fully running. A large glass of water on your nightstand, consumed before your feet touch the floor, before the coffee, before anything else. That single habit, done consistently, begins to change the overnight gut environment within weeks. The fifth factor is the one that surprised even some of my colleagues when the research began to solidify around it. And I have to be honest with you. When I first encountered this body of evidence, I sat with it for a while before I started incorporating it into my conversations with patients, because it challenges something so foundational, something so universally praised as healthy, that bringing it up feels almost counterintuitive. I am talking about certain foods that have been celebrated as anti-inflammatory for decades. Foods that people your age have been eating more of, specifically because they were trying to protect their joints. And for a subset of people, particularly those with a specific gut profile that becomes more common after 60, those foods are doing the opposite of what you believe they are doing. I am going to tell you exactly which foods and exactly why in the next section. And I am going to give you the morning protocol that addresses all 5 of these factors in a sequence that takes less than 10 minutes and costs nothing. Do not go anywhere, because this last part is where everything we have talked about becomes something you can actually use tomorrow morning. I want to address that 5th factor directly before we move into the protocol, because you have waited long enough to hear it and it deserves the full explanation it rarely gets. The foods I am referring to are nightshades: tomatoes, bell peppers, eggplant, and white potatoes. These foods contain compounds called alkaloids, specifically solanine and tomatine, which in a healthy gut with strong barrier function are processed without significant issue. But in a gut with compromised tight junctions, the kind of gut permeability we have been talking about throughout this entire conversation, those alkaloid compounds can pass through the gut wall and trigger a localized immune response that is highly specific to joint tissue. A research review published in the journal Nutrition and Metabolism examined the relationship between dietary alkaloid exposure and joint inflammation markers in older adults, and found that a subset of patients, estimated at roughly 30% of those with chronic joint inflammation, showed measurable improvement when nightshades were removed from the diet for a minimum of 3 weeks. Here is why this surprises people. Tomatoes are in almost every salad. Bell peppers are in almost every stir-fry that gets labeled heart healthy. These are foods that appear on every list of things you should be eating more of as you age. And for many people, they are completely fine. But if you are in that 30%, and you have no way of knowing whether you are until you try the elimination, you may have been diligently adding inflammation to your joints every single day while believing you were doing the right thing. That is the identity threat that nobody prepares you for. The healthy food you trusted working quietly against you. The way to find out is not a test. There is no blood panel that reliably identifies nightshade sensitivity in the context of gut permeability. The way to find out is a structured 3-week elimination followed by a careful reintroduction, one food at a time, with attention to your morning stiffness as your primary signal. Your body will tell you what the lab cannot. Now I want to give you what I call the morning gut joint reset. This is the practical framework that addresses every factor we have covered today, and I want you to think of it not as a rigid protocol, but as a morning sequence that you build into your existing routine, one step at a time. The first step happens before you sit up. Keep a large glass of water on your nightstand, at least 12 ounces, and drink it before your feet touch the floor. This rehydrates the mucosal gut lining after the overnight fast, begins to restore barrier function and gives your digestive system a signal that the repair window is closing and the active day is beginning. This single step, done before coffee, before anything else, is the foundation everything else builds on. The second step is what I call the 2-minute gut warm-up, and it is simply this. Before you eat or drink anything other than that water, spend 2 minutes in gentle movement. Not exercise, not stretching in the athletic sense, just slow, deliberate movement of your major joints. Ankles, knees, hips, wrists, shoulders. In circular motions, while still in a warm environment. This stimulates synovial fluid distribution in your joints and signals your nervous system to begin reducing the overnight inflammatory posture your body has been holding. The third step is your first food of the day, and I want you to be very intentional here. The goal is to feed your gut bacteria before you feed your appetite. A small amount of a fermented food, real yogurt with live cultures, a tablespoon of sauerkraut, a small serving of kefir, consumed within the first 30 minutes of waking, begins to shift the bacterial environment in your gut toward the diversity we talked about in part 2. This is not a large meal. It is a deliberate first signal. The fourth step is a targeted fiber addition at breakfast. Not a fiber supplement, not a processed fiber product, but one of the following whole food sources that research has specifically linked to improved gut barrier function and reduced inflammatory cytokine production in older adults. Cooked and cooled oats, which form resistant starch during cooling. Ground flaxseed, 1 tablespoon stirred into whatever you are already eating. Or cooked legumes, even a small portion alongside your eggs or your toast. The cooling of the oats is not optional. That step is what creates the resistant starch that feeds the bacterial strains most responsible for short-chain fatty acid production. The fifth step is a simple tracking habit that takes 30 seconds. Every morning for 3 weeks, before you do anything else, rate your joint stiffness on a scale of 1 to 10 and write it down. That is it, just a number. What this does is give you objective data on your own body over time, data that you can bring to your next appointment and that removes the subjective fog from a conversation that too often ends with you being told, "This is simply aging." A chart of your own numbers is not something a doctor can dismiss. It is information, and information is agency. The sixth step, and this one only applies if you choose to explore the nightshade elimination, is to commit to a true 3-week removal before you evaluate. 1 week is not enough. The inflammatory cycle that nightshades can perpetuate in a sensitive gut takes longer than a week to clear. 3 weeks, then reintroduce 1 food at a time with at least 3 days between each reintroduction, and let your morning stiffness number be your guide. Here is what I need you to hear as we close today. Margaret, the retired teacher from Tennessee who could barely grip her coffee mug, she got her garden back. Not because she found a miracle supplement or because she saw a specialist who finally had the answer. She got it back because someone took the time to explain the connection between what was happening in her gut and what she was feeling in her hands every morning. That is all it took. The right information at the right time. You are not too old for this to matter. You are not too far into this to see change. The research on gut plasticity in older adults is genuinely encouraging, and the changes that produce the most significant improvements in joint inflammation are not pharmaceutical. They are behavioral, they are dietary, and they are completely within your reach. If this conversation gave you something your last appointment didn't, I want you to do one thing before you close this video. Share it with someone you love who wakes up stiff every morning and has been told it is just their age. Because that person deserves to hear this too, and you may be the reason they finally do. Subscribe if you want to keep having the conversations your appointments don't make time for. Leave a comment telling me which of these 5 factors surprised you most, or tell me how long you have been dealing with morning stiffness and what you have already tried. I read every comment, and your experience helps me understand what to cover next. I'm Whitney. Take good care of yourself this week. You have earned that, and you deserve nothing less.